Captain David McLean. I was with Eastwind Airlines, and I was the primary witness to the accident when TWA blew up. At the time of the accident, we were overhead Long Island at about 16,000 feet, headed out over the water. It was dusk. It was around 8:30 in the evening. You could see a long ways, a good 50, 60, 70 miles or more. I saw this flight departing out of JFK with a bright light, kind of yellowish colors. Bright light, kind of yellowish colors. And I mentioned to my first officer, and we thought that possibly it might even been a fire, but there was no smoke or anything, and surmised it was probably the landing light. They were crossing our flight path. They were moving from the right to the left, so we had a very good sight of them. They were about 13 miles ahead of us, and I flicked on the landing lights to let them know I saw him, and at that exact instant he blew up. It exploded right in front of me. It was a big fireball, and almost immediately you could see the two wings fall off, and the fuel was obviously coming out of the wings, and then of course it was all on fire. So there were these long fiery streamers going about 3,000 to 4,000 feet from the wings, all the way down to the water. I reported almost immediately there's been an in-flight explosion.
We just saw an explosion out here at 5507.
5507, I'm sorry, I missed it. You're out of 18, did you say something else?
We just saw an explosion up ahead of us here. Someone's about 16,000 feet or something like that. It just went down to the water.
TWA 800 Center.
I think that was him.
I think so.
The FBI witness forms, the 302 forms, were held basically as top secret documents. Not even the NTSB was allowed to have copies of those forms.
Among the witnesses, Paul Angelides, a structural engineer. Angelides was vacationing at a beach house in West Hampton, Long Island, directly opposite the crash site.
The first thing that attracted my attention was a red phosphorescent object pretty high up in the sky and close to the beach. Was a red phosphorescent object pretty high up in the sky and close to the beach. And it looked like it was changing direction. It had a little parabolic smoke trail behind it. I then saw that object converging with aircraft lights. There was a flash, and there was a pause, and there was another flash. And then ultimately there was a huge fireball.
The fact that here I am, 25 years in the Navy, 25 and a half years. Electronic warfare technician, qualified CIC watch officer, surface warfare qualified, been stationed on an aircraft carrier, stood watch on it in an aircraft carrier as an assistant TKO. I understand relative motion, relative bearing, and I figured I would have been a good witness, and probably the only witness with that level of knowledge and expertise looking down on what became TWA 800. In fact, whatever I saw, whatever the flare-like object in fact was, in fact, whatever I saw, whatever the flare-like object in fact was moving in the same direction as the U.S. airplane. It appeared to be climbing up and moving parallel with the U.S. airplane.
And I was pulling my boat back in, I was tying it up, and the guy next to me was tying his boat up, and we were just talking, and the guy said, "Hey, look at the flare." And I turned around, looked at the flare, and I'm like, wow, somebody must have some trouble in the bay. And no sooner I said that, the thing just like exploded, and it looked like a Christmas tree of fire going down to the water.
It was this brittle, shadow, white puffball on the side of the plane, and I'm very relieved because I figured that it didn't impact on the plane, so the plane will be all right. But at the same time, I see this other object that's coming up from underneath the plane, in the shadow of the plane that looks just like this other object had done. And then the plane stopped in the middle of the sky from where it was, and it just stopped there in the sky, and then it goes down, and then I can see all along the side of the plane, and then the plane shatters.
There were objects that traveled a great distance from outside of this plane and converged on the plane. These objects didn't fly off of the plane. They came at the plane.
He reports seeing an object like a firework ascend fairly quick, then slow and wiggle, then speed up and disappear. Then he sees a second object that glimmered in the sky higher than the first, then a red dot move up to that object, then a puff of smoke, then another puff, then a firebox.
We have a massive investigation ongoing.
I'm Jim Kallstrom, and I was in charge of the FBI's TWA investigation. When this tragedy happened, the country was at a very high state of alert. Within a day and a half, I had 1,000 agents working on the case. I immediately thought this was more than likely terrorism. We didn't know for sure. But the fact that a 747 blew up in a fireball, that's not a normal thing to happen. The fact that numerous shoulder-fired missiles were lost over the years from different thefts from armories around the world. Within 10 minutes of it happening, we had people calling our command center and telling us they saw things ascending into the sky. So we took that very seriously. It had hundreds of people say they saw things from their porches, from their boats, and that's why we put a lot of emphasis on the missile theory.
In one of the congressional hearings, the FBI testified that there were no eyewitnesses to the crash that described seeing a missile. And this is a point that critics have pounced on in later years.
Would you give us some information on how many witnesses on the ground or in other airplanes at the time believed they saw something coming from the ground headed toward that plane?
Well, I wouldn't want to say that they all saw something coming from the ground. There were about 200 people that saw events in the sky that they described, none of which described a missile. As I look back at the question, I could have probably been more articulate and said that a lot of the witnesses used the term missile, and they were good people, and they're not making up a story. But the reality is, none of those people saw a missile. Their description of what they saw does not fit what a missile would actually look like.